So just to introduce the subject, much work has been recently done on the Kura-Araxes culture in its core area, the Southern Caucasus. And we have now numerous recently excavated and well-published sites, which provided a base of data to investigate the most diverse aspects of this widespread cultural complex. And we have a sufficient number of absolute dates to understand its general chronology. Although not issues are completely solved, and some questions remain concerning, for instance, the earliest appearance, the inner periodization, and especially the regional variation. One can state that its main features are now sufficiently clear and agreed upon by most specialists, as synthesized in the Paleorian volume edited by Chatanier and Palumbi in 2004. On the contrary, the post-Kura-Araxes period remains poorly defined already in terms of its absolute chronology. At the first approximation, it spans the second half of the 3rd millennium BC. But if the end of the Kura-Araxes culture can be reasonably set around 2500 BC, when a clear discontinuity in many aspects of landscape occupation and material culture can be seen in most of the concerned regions. On the other hand, the onset of the Middle Bronze trialative Anaanzor culture, which marks its end, is much more vague, although it is most probably to be set somewhere around 2000 to 100 or even a bit earlier. So the period is generally defined as the early Kurgan, the age of the early Kurgan cultures, an age marked in terms of landscape occupation by the generalized diffusion of funerary mounds, by the abandonment of many settlement sites, and the apparent adoption of a more mobile style of life, and in terms of material culture, by the appearance of new pottery styles, mud copy and Bedeni, and also by the diffusion and use of precious metals and elaborate jewelry. On the surface, the distinction thus seems rather easy. For instance, in funerary customs, where we have different funerary customs versus the generalized adoptions of funerary barrows, in pottery styles and in metal ornaments. However, as soon as we get into details, it becomes a bit blurred and somehow contradictory. I'm sorry, I just have to make, yes. So first of all, while the special distribution of the Kura-Araxes culture is by now well defined and can be distinguished into core, expansion area, and sporadic occurrences of Kura-Araxes items with well investigated regional variants. The distribution of areas of the early Kurgan cultures have never been systematically defined, although there are some attempts, and we know that more or less they are there. And anyway, it is evident that they represent a much more local phenomenon compared to the Kura-Araxes cultures. Both eponymous sites, Marcopi and Bedeni, are located in southeastern Georgia, as well as Trialeti on the Tzadkak Plateau, where the first early Kurgan sites had been discovered by Kuftin in the 1930s. In fact, the relevant assemblages have been mainly defined by Georgian archaeologists based on the discoveries of large kurgans made in the post-war Second World War age in their country, and not without some inconsistencies, such as, for instance, the definition of an early Trialeti assemblage or culture, which later on turned out to be more or less equivalent with mud copy. So a recent attempt by Eleonora Carminati to produce a gazetteer of mud copy and Bedeni sites shows that they indeed cover approximately the same region. This is a more recent composite distribution map, except for the fact that Bedeni sites are apparently a bit more numerous and extend over a slightly larger area. As for dates, generally, mud copy is considered earlier than Bedeni, but with large overlappings between Kura-Araxes and mud copy and mud copy and Bedeni. So when, however, we proceed beyond this general level, everything becomes much more uncertain. First of all, can we really trust these distribution maps? There are different problems concerning these issues. So unpublished material is the first one. This is a problem for all periods and assemblages, but it becomes serious when attributions of wares are inconsistent or unclear, and therefore even material which is published without good illustrations cannot be reliably attributed. There are good reasons, for instance, to suppose that sites with early Kurgan material outside of Georgia, where local excavators are sometimes less familiar with these designations, are more common than it seems. Second problem is the difficulty in distinguishing sporadic occurrences of mud copy Bedeni material within different assemblages from whole assemblages which can be attributed to these styles or cultures in inverted commas. This can only be done after careful examination and quantitative evaluation of each context, something which can rarely, if ever, be done in our case. For instance, how are we to judge the occurrences of rare Bedeni vessels and sherds in large collective graves at VELIKENT in Daghestan, which were apparently in use for several generations, as isolated imports, or rather as evidence for the easternmost distribution of the Bedeni cultural influence? Or, just to make another example, are we to consider this vessel from PICHORI on the western coast of Georgia as true Bedeni items or only as vaguely reminiscent of them? This is difficult to say without autoptic examination and based only on descriptions and small-scale drawings. Especially outside of Georgia, mud copy Bedeni assemblages are often not clearly distinguished or maybe not distinguishable from each other and coexist with persisting Kura-Araxes elements. We may therefore presume that the presence of these pottery styles is somehow underestimated, as they may have been misidentified or published as belonging to a generic late Kura-Araxes phase. In Azerbaijan, for instance, this tomb from Azanzu in the Astafa district was first classified as Kura-Araxes by the excavators and later tentatively reclassified as mud copy. As at Mentesh Tepe in the Tovush district, on the other hand, this Kurgan number 54 was attributed to the mud copy phase and in fact yielded some absolute dates which are in the beginning of the second half of the third millennium. However, beside pottery, which has mud copy, definitely mud copy features, and pottery, although it shows some continuity with the Kura-Araxes production, it contains also this small bag of a shape which in other excavations is generally considered as typically Bedeni. Similar problematic or shifting attributions which create confusion occur elsewhere as well. For instance, at Sosuyuk in southeastern Turkey, a comparison between different publications shows that the attribution of pottery from level 4A was sometimes modified in the course of time. So from early Trialeti to Marcopi, or from Trialeti to Bedeni, and so on. Very strange is, for instance, the attribution to the Bedeni assemblage in the 2004 publication, maybe it is just a mistake, of items which are generally considered late to Kura-Araxes or made with Marcopi. But even in Georgia, the situation is not so clear. Let's consider, for instance, the well-known monumental barrows from ANANAURI in Kakheti. Kurgans 1 and 2 have been, rightly in my opinion, attributed by Ortmann to the matte copy phase. This is the pottery assemblage from Kurgan number 1, which is my personal opinion, would define as matte copy pot containing matte copy pottery and pottery, post-Kura-Araxes pottery in the late Kura-Araxes tradition. I refer explicitly to the vessel on the bottom right. This is now the assemblage from Kurgan 2, also ascribed by Ortmann to the Marcopi period. And it has a typical Marcopi pottery and this pendant that we already discussed before. Now, we don't have C14 dates for these two kurgans, but let's now consider the famous kurgan number 3. Excavated in 2002, which the excavators attributes to the Bedeni culture. This is C14 dated to around 2400 BC. But if we consider the pottery which is published from this kurgan, we see that it is very similar to the one from the previous one and does not, in fact, contain any typical Bedeni pottery type. So a last example is the recent publication about Rabatits Valley, which is one of the few sites of Georgia which hosted a settlement with a clear Bedeni assemblages. Here, it seems that Marcopi pottery was very rare, and in fact, few fragments of it are illustrated, and it seems to actually to have Marcopi features. But when mentioning vessels from other sites, it seems that the excavators include in the Bedeni assemblages some items, and I marked them here in red ellipses, which others would consider typical Marcopi, classical Marcopi sites. I also would like to point out on the top right the vessels which are similar to the ones in ANANAURI. So clearly there is a considerable degree of confusion even in defining the different pottery styles in use in the post-Kura-Araxes period. And well, I think that without reaching an agreement about the terminology, even the very necessary accumulation of new reliable C14 dates will not by itself solve the problem of the post-Kura-Araxes period and its material culture. So what I think is needed is, first of all, that pottery assemblages are published as completely and with as many good illustrations as possible, and with reliable stratigraphic context. Secondly, a common effort in providing agreed definitions of the different pottery styles based on material from different sites seems unescapable to me. A further step may then be to do the same for other classes of artifacts, for instance, metal objects and archaeological features. So only once the mutual associations between all these elements will be verified against a sufficient number of reliable, high precision, absolute dates, will we be able to decide whether Marcopi and Bedeni should be merely considered as different and partially co-occurring pottery styles, or as chronological stages or as separate cultures. So from purely impressionistic point of view, it appears to me that there are indeed different and well distinguishable pottery assemblages. I mean characteristic associations of types of fabric, shapes and decorations, which characterize successive chronological phases, with possible short periods of coexistence or the presence of a few transitional types and possibly regional variants. On the other hand, I think that some of these, at least of the supposedly mixed assemblages, can be proved to be the result either of terminological confusion or of stratigraphic disturbances. The latter is a problem which has not been paid enough attention until recently. In fact, most settlement sites in the Southern Caucasus are small sites with thin occupational layers cut not only by a large number of later pits, here is the example of NATSARGORA on the left, but also affected by pervasive bioperturbance by small mammals like mice and foxes. This is a chalcolithic example, but the problem is the same. So these animals dig long burrows throughout the anthropic layers. Also, it became clear that some funerary contexts, some large kurgans in particular, far from representing ideal closed contexts, were in fact often reopened and tampered with for successive interment and other ritual actions, sometimes for a considerably long time. So evidence for this complex situation is very difficult to observe unless microstratigraphic excavations methods are systematically used. And even in this phase, it can be easily missed. So in the following, I'll try to elaborate on this concept, especially focusing on the Shida Kartli project, province of Georgia, where during the last 10 years, the Georgian-Italian Shida Kartli archaeological project investigated the NATSARGORA and Aradetis-Orgora settlements and the NATSARGORA, DoghLauri and Okerakevi cemeteries. So in order to avoid misunderstandings, I will first of all provide my definition of the relevant ceramic assemblages so that it will be clear for everybody what I am talking about. For the Kura-Araxes period, I will use the traditional ceramic periodization into phases 1, 2, and 3, which in my opinion better fits this region rather than the bipartite one recently preferred by most scholars, which I think better fits Armenia, for instance. Briefly, phase 1, which is not illustrated here as it does not concern us, is characterized by monochrome ware. Phase 2 by the prevalence of red-black varnished ware, and phase 3 by the spreading of black varnished ware, incised and relief decoration, and by morphological details such as raised base, slightly convex shoulders, doubly carenated profiles like in the bolts on the bottom right. So archaeometric analysis on Kura-Araxes samples from NATSARGORA highlighted that the Kura-Araxes ware is exclusively handmade using raw material local origin. The fabric doesn't show any function-related dissimilarities. The use of grog as temper is a typical but not ubiquitous feature, and a thin slip was applied on some, but apparently not on all vessels. So Marcopi type vessels were not plentiful in the sites we excavated. They are shown on the left. So I will also use examples from other sites to the right to illustrate what I mean for Marcopi. This group is in fact among the three, the one which mostly still needs being precisely defined, as it shows a high continuity with the late Kura-Araxes production, and also the common wares are poorly known. So black varnished surfaces, markedly biconical concave convex profiles, and incised hatched decoration are its characteristic features. Archaeometric analysis of a few samples from NATSARGORA highlighted some potential differences with both Kura-Araxes and Bedeni, but did not in fact bring very conclusive results because the samples were too few. So Bedeni pottery can be divided into two different wares. Bedeni fine, which is found both in funerary and in settlement contexts, and Bedeni coarse, which is mainly found in the latter. The morphological repertoire and range of decorations of the fine ware are well known. It consists of refined and elaborated vessels, which were probably manufactured for display and use in particular occasions, like banquets and funeral ceremonies. Typical shapes are the vertical-sided cups and pots with spurred handles. Vessels often bear geometric incised decoration and relief bands, vertical channeling, and rectangular lugs on the neck of the vessels are also common. Some vessels were possibly finished on a rotating device. The fabric is fine-grained, very fine-grained and compact. Tempers were employed in reduced quantities and finely crushed. Among these, the occasional presence of obsidian is remarkable. Surfaces are often of black and dark colors. The exceptional sheen of some of them is the result of a high concentration of hematite due to careful polishing. So Bedeni coarse ware is characterized by completely different features. It has lighter colors, usually brownish or reddish, and polished surfaces are absolutely absent. Vessels can bear rows of nail or finger impressions or irregular groups of incisions with casual orientation. In spite of the rather coarse fabric, archaeometric analysis highlighted a careful selection of tempering materials, which include carefully sifted sand. We can now go back to discuss the early Kurgan period pattern of occupation in Shida Kartli. This is an only slightly updated version of the distribution map from a recent article by Eleonora Carminati, whom I thank. A comparison with the map of the Kura-Araxes occupation confirms a remarkable change in settlement patterns. The number of settlements radically decreases, while that of funerary sites contextually increases. More specifically, while in the former period settlements are often joined by adjacent cemeteries, in the latter period isolated burial sites, individual kurgans or kurgan fields predominate. Preliminary analysis of the pottery assemblages confirms that very few, if any, mixed assemblages exist, although it is not common to find a few sherds of a different pottery style within the assemblage of a layer generally attributed to another group. Concerning settlements, a degree of continuity between Kura-Araxes and Marcopi can be seen at Sikiagora, where a level with late Kura-Araxes, so Kura-Araxes 3 in my terminology, pottery to the left, is followed by a level B, is followed by a layer level A, whose pottery shows late Kura-Araxes and Marcopi features. So Bedeni pottery is also said to be present at this site, but a superficial autoptic examination of the material shows that it seems to be very little and it may derive from pits. A possible scenario is that of a Kura-Araxes settlement which is abandoned at the beginning of the Marcopi phase. In fact, pottery from Psychiagora bears some similarity with the pottery from Badani, further to the east, which is one of the few Georgian settlements attributed to the Marcopi phase. And again, you see these vessels on the top left, which are similar to ANANAURI. So coexistence, direct continuity between Kura-Araxes and Bedeni, on the contrary, seems not yet attested. In the case of PICHORI-NATSARGORA, I think we proved that the alleged Kura-Araxes Bedeni assemblage is due to some Bedeni pits and further disturbances cutting a Kura-Araxes II, so not a late Kura-Araxes but an earlier Kura-Araxes settlement, as also proved by the absence of any Bedeni pottery in the adjacent Kura-Araxes cemetery, where no kurgan but only pit graves are attested. The site yielded only very few sporadic Marcopi shells. At Aradeti-Sorgora, evidence suggests the presence of Kura-Araxes II and III and also Bedeni occupational layers in both excavated areas, but of no layer yielding both wares, not in significant amount, while no Marcopi material has until now been identified. The Bedeni presence at the site may be connected with the nearby occupation at Berikildebi, only 1.5 kilometers away. So with the exception of Berikildebi, evidence suggests that the presence of Kura-Araxes II and with the exception of Berikildebi, Bedeni settlements in the region mostly yielded pits or ephemeral structures, which were possibly the seat of periodic ritual ceremonies involving the distribution of food and beverages. This may be proved not only by the elaborate pottery repertoire, but also by the presence at NATSARGORA, for instance, of complete vessels in pits and of terracotta reliefs depicting some sort of supernatural entity with obsidian inlaid eyes. Funerary evidence is more complex to interpret. In general, the transition from the Kura-Araxes to the early Kurgan period in Shida Kartli shows a clear shift from cemeteries like NATSARGORA and Aradeti-Sorgora DOGHLAURI to barrow graves. Within the Kura-Araxes period, there seems to be an increase from Kura-Araxes 2 to 3, an increase in the frequency of collective graves, possibly to be interpreted as family graves, in comparison with individual ones, associated also with a slight increase in the number and value of burial goods, which might suggest an increase in social stratification, but really very slight, as burial goods remains on the whole rather modest and of the same types of objects. The early Kurgan period funerary barrows in Shida Kartli are, however, rather small in comparison with the monumental kurgans attested elsewhere in Georgia, and they also do not contain a comparable wealth of material. Marcopi and Bedeni barrows are rather similar to each other, apparently, both in construction and, except for pottery, in burial goods. And there are even a couple of cases, like Keltubani and Kovle, where the same kurgan contained both Marcopi and Bedeni vessels, or vessels of uncertain attribution. So the Bedeni kurgan excavated by our expedition at Okherakevi is a typical example of the Shida Kartli early Kurgan period barrow. It is rather small, 10 by 4 by 5 meters, but possibly partially eroded, and contained only 2 pottery vessels, fragments of obsidian, and small fragments of human bones and 1 human tooth. Similar Bedeni kurgans, a bit larger and richer, however, are also present at Bebnisi near Berikildebi, not far from Aradeti-Sorgora. But on the other hand, there is another strange case, the discovery at the DOGHLAURI cemetery, where we have about 60 Kura-Araxes graves that I showed before, of a single Bedeni grave. This proves that the old Kura-Araxes cemetery of Aradeti-Sorgora was still in use during the early Kurgan period. This grave, 2013-175, was a moderately wealthy stone-lined pit grave, similar to in its layout to some Kura-Araxes graves in the same cemetery. Which suggests that old burial types had not been completely superseded by the new Kurgan fashion. So in other terms, in Shida Kartli at least, the change in burial customs appears to have been more nuanced and gradual than generally admitted, and to have included the presence of transitional situations and even a certain degree of hybridity. So thank you very much for your attention.